The spaceship carrying Princess Ilara landed softly on the military base of Earth. The smooth hum of the engines came to a quiet stop as the door opened. The princess stepped out, her every movement graceful and measured. As the only heir to her people, she had been trained her entire life to lead with poise and elegance. Nothing ever seemed to shake her composure, until now. Before her stood a human soldier, his eyes studying her as if she were the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Jack, the soldier assigned to protect her during the peace negotiations, was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated a sense of calm confidence that Ilara couldn't help but notice. She had heard that humans could be unpredictable, but she didn't expect such directness from one who was supposed to be her guard. Jack didn't bow as the other soldiers did. Instead, he nodded respectfully, his eyes locked with hers. Ilara had no choice but to return the gesture, her expression as neutral as ever. She was the princess. She would not let anything disturb her focus. "Princess Ilara," Jack said in a voice that was firm but polite. "I'm Jack, your assigned soldier. I'll be with you during your stay here." Ilara nodded, her long silver hair flowing with the movement. "I trust you understand the importance of this mission, Jack," she replied, her voice calm but commanding. She was used to giving orders, not receiving them, and she expected no different from this human soldier. "Yes, Mom," Jack said with a smile that seemed far too confident for her taste. "I'm ready to ensure your safety, whatever it takes." For a moment, Ilara studied him. Jack was not the type of soldier she expected. He wasn't like the others in the Alliance, who were trained for war and combat. He didn't carry the air of intimidation, or the sharpness that others of his kind seemed to have. Instead, he had a quiet assurance, one that came from experience and confidence. This would be an interesting challenge for Ilara. She had been taught to handle even the most dangerous situations without ever losing control. But she wasn't sure how she would handle this human soldier who seemed to keep pushing her boundaries, despite his respectful manner. As they walked together toward the main building, Ilara kept her distance. She was accustomed to solitude, especially when traveling between different planets and territories. Her people, the Xilians, valued privacy and quiet contemplation. But Jack seemed to have no interest in silence. He walked beside her, occasionally glancing at her with those piercing eyes. "Your people are quite fascinating," Jack remarked after a few moments of walking. "You have an entire culture built around peace, don't you? It's different from ours." Ilara raised an eyebrow. She wasn't sure if he was teasing or genuinely curious. Either way, she didn't like the direction of the conversation. "We believe in maintaining peace through understanding, Jack," she answered coolly. "It is something you humans could learn from." Jack didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he chuckled softly. "Maybe. But we also know how to defend ourselves when the time comes. I don't think that's something we'd be willing to trade for peace." Ilara felt the weight of his words. She had heard stories about humans, how they fought fiercely for what they believed in. It was a quality that both intrigued and frightened her. She had seen the history of their wars on their home planet, and knew they could be just as dangerous as they were peaceful. "I understand that, Jack," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But war is not always the answer." Jack nodded but didn't say anything more. The silence between them was thick, and Ilara could feel the tension building. She didn't like it. She didn't like the way Jack's quiet confidence made her second-guess herself. She was supposed to be the one in control, not him. As they entered the large conference room, Ilara took her seat at the head of the table. She could feel Jack's eyes on her, studying her every move. He seemed unfazed by the fact that he was in the presence of a princess, and it irritated her. She had expected respect, but Jack treated her as if she were just another person, just another soldier. Ilara crossed her arms, determined to regain control of the situation. She couldn't afford to lose her composure. Not here, not now, not in front of this human. "Are there any questions about the schedule for tomorrow's meetings?" she asked, her voice calm and unwavering. The room went silent, but she could feel Jack's presence beside her, waiting, observing. "I have a question," Jack said, breaking the silence. "How do you remain so calm? I've been around a lot of high-ranking officers, but none of them have the kind of composure you do." Ilara's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice steady. "It is my responsibility to maintain control. I can't afford to be anything less than composed, Jack." He nodded, clearly satisfied with her answer, but she couldn't help but notice the amusement in his eyes. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't impressed in the way she was used to. This human soldier, this Jack, was proving to be far more difficult to understand than she had anticipated. The day began with an early briefing. Ilara sat at the long table, her back straight, her eyes focused on the holographic images of the upcoming peace talks. The room was filled with high-ranking officials from various planets, but Ilara remained quiet, absorbing every detail. She had done this countless times before, but today there was an unfamiliar feeling in the air. Jack was seated nearby, his presence always just a few feet away. His eyes were sharp, constantly moving as he observed everyone and everything around him. Ilara couldn't help but notice how relaxed he seemed, even when surrounded by powerful figures. It was as though he didn't feel the weight of the situation the same way she did. As the meeting continued, Ilara found herself distracted. She tried to focus on the details of the peace treaty, but Jack's steady gaze kept drawing her attention. She could feel him watching her, and for the first time, it unsettled her. It was like his eyes could see right through her carefully constructed facade. She cleared her throat and addressed the room. "The terms of the treaty must be clear to all involved. We cannot afford to make any mistakes." Her voice was steady, her words precise. But as she spoke, she felt Jack's eyes on her again. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel vulnerable. After the meeting, Ilara decided to take a walk through the base's courtyard to clear her mind. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the distant hills. It was peaceful, but Ilara's thoughts were far from calm. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and that something was Jack. As she walked, Jack appeared beside her, almost as if he had been waiting for her. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said, his voice casual, but with a hint of something deeper. Ilara nodded, but didn't reply immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. The air between them had changed, and she didn't know how to react to it. Jack's presence was too strong for her to ignore. She had spent her life around royalty and dignitaries, people who understood the importance of distance, but Jack didn't follow those rules. He was different. "You know," Jack continued, his voice low, "I've never met anyone like you before, Princess. Most people in your position would be, well, a little more distant. You're not like that." Ilara turned to look at him, her expression hardening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharp. Jack smiled slightly, his eyes softening. "You're not what I expected. I thought you'd be cold, distant, and maybe a little unapproachable. But you're not. You seem human, at least a little." Ilara felt a strange knot in her chest. He was too perceptive. She had tried to keep her emotions hidden, to maintain the walls she had built over the years. But now, here was this human soldier who had managed to break through those walls without even trying. "I'm not like other Exilians," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "but I have my responsibilities." Jack nodded, understanding, but there was still something in his eyes that made Ilara uneasy. "I get it, but it must be hard, always being in control. You don't have to do everything on your own, you know. Sometimes it's okay to let your guard down." Ilara looked away, her eyes scanning the horizon. She wasn't used to this kind of conversation. She had always been the one to give orders, to maintain control. But now, with Jack, she found herself questioning everything she had always known. For a moment, there was a silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with something neither of them fully understood. "We should return to the base," Ilara said finally, her tone colder than she intended. She turned and started walking back, Jack falling into step beside her. As they walked, Jack seemed to sense her need for space. He didn't speak again, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Ilara's mind raced. She had been trained to remain calm, to handle any situation with grace and dignity. But Jack's words, his presence, were making it difficult to focus. They reached the main building, and Jack opened the door for her, as he had done countless times before. Ilara stepped inside, her thoughts still unsettled. She didn't understand why Jack's words had affected her so much. She had dealt with many soldiers in her life, and none of them had made her feel the way Jack did. He wasn't intimidated by her, and that was something she wasn't used to. Inside, the peace talks were about to begin, and Ilara forced herself to focus. But as she sat at the table, Jack once again took his position by her side. His calm presence was a constant, and it irritated Ilara more than she cared to admit. She couldn't figure him out, and that was the problem. She didn't like feeling uncertain, and yet, with Jack, she couldn't help but feel just that. The meeting began, and Ilara did her best to concentrate on the task at hand. But every time Jack's gaze met hers, a wave of unease washed over her. She tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but it lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. She was the princess, and she would not let anything, or anyone, make her lose control. But as the meeting continued, Ilara couldn't help but wonder how long she could keep up the facade. How long could she stay composed in the face of a human soldier who seemed to know exactly how to unravel her? The days on the military base passed quickly, but Ilara found it harder and harder to stay focused. The peace talks had begun, and while they were crucial, it was becoming more difficult to keep her attention on them. There was something about Jack that she couldn't shake. His presence was like a constant pull on her thoughts, and no matter how much she tried to push it aside, it was always there, just beneath the surface. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized how little she understood about him. Jack was unlike any other human she had met. He wasn't afraid of her, nor did he treat her as if she were some untouchable royalty. Instead, he spoke to her as though they were equals, and that irritated her in a way she couldn't explain. Today, they were walking through the training area of the base, where soldiers practiced their combat skills. Jack had insisted that Ilara join him for a demonstration, saying it would give her a better understanding of the human military. Ilara didn't see the point, but she agreed nonetheless, as she had learned long ago that it was important to show interest in other cultures, even if she didn't understand them fully. As they approached the training area, the sounds of weapons clashing and soldiers shouting filled the air. The soldiers were sparring with each other, their movements fast and precise. Ilara couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for their skills, even if she didn't agree with their methods. Violence had always been a last resort for her people. Impressive, don't you think? Jack said beside her, his eyes scanning the soldiers as they fought. Ilara nodded but didn't say anything. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking she was impressed. But the truth was, she was. She had never seen combat quite like this before. The speed, the precision, the intensity, it was all so different from the peaceful ways of the Xilians. One of the soldiers, noticing Ilara's gaze, broke away from the sparring match and walked over. He was tall, with short-cropped hair and a confident smile. "Princess Ilara, would you like to see a demonstration up close?" he asked, his tone respectful but eager. Ilara glanced at Jack, who gave her a subtle nod, signaling that it was okay to observe. She wasn't sure why she needed Jack's permission, but for some reason, she felt safer with him nearby. It frustrated her to no end. "Very well," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Show me your technique." The soldier moved into position, and within seconds, he was sparring with another soldier at lightning speed. The clash of their weapons echoed in the air, and Ilara couldn't help but watch in awe. She had never seen anything like it before. The humans fought with such power and confidence, each movement calculated and precise. As the demonstration ended, the soldier bowed to her. "Do you understand now, princess?" he asked. Ilara nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand. But it is not the way of my people," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Violence should only be used when there is no other choice." The soldier looked at her for a moment, as if considering her words. "I understand your people's way, but sometimes the world doesn't give us the luxury of choice," he said before walking back to join the others. Ilara turned to Jack, who had been watching silently. "Do you believe that, Jack?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you believe that violence is sometimes the only way?" Jack seemed to think for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, yes, but only when there's no other way to protect the people you care about," he said, his voice steady. "I know that's not what you believe, princess, but it's how we're taught." Ilara frowned. "I don't understand. There's always a way to avoid violence." "There must be." Jack looked at her, his expression soft but serious. "Not always. Sometimes the threat is so great that you have to fight to survive. It's not something we choose. It's something we're forced into." Ilara remained silent, processing his words. She had always believed that peace could be achieved through understanding, through dialogue. But Jack's words made her question that belief, even if only for a moment. As the day wore on, Ilara found herself increasingly lost in thought. The conversations with Jack were beginning to make her see things from a different perspective. She wasn't sure if she liked it, but she couldn't deny that he was challenging everything she thought she knew about the world. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ilara stood alone on the balcony of her quarters, gazing out at the stars. The peaceful quiet of the night was a welcome relief after the day's events, but even in the stillness, her thoughts were far from calm. Jack's words echoed in her mind. Was violence really sometimes necessary? She had never considered it before. Her people had always found ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to war. But what if Jack was right? What if, in some situations, peace wasn't enough? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She turned to find Jack standing in the doorway, looking as composed as ever. "Princess," he said softly, "I just wanted to check on you. It's been a long day." Ilara didn't know why she felt a strange mix of frustration and gratitude. She hadn't asked for Jack's concern, but there it was, hovering between them like an unspoken bond. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice more tired than she had intended. "Thank you." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. "If you need anything, I'm here." And with that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Ilara stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She had never been one to rely on others, but Jack was making her question that part of herself. Why did he care? Why was he so determined to be a part of her life, even when she kept pushing him away? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing. Things were changing, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep her composure. The days grew longer on the military base as Ilara's internal conflict deepened. Despite her attempts to remain focused on the peace talks, her thoughts kept drifting back to Jack. Every time they crossed paths, she felt that same pull, a feeling that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. Ilara was no stranger to the concept of control. As an alien princess, she had been taught from a young age to manage her emotions, to present herself as composed, and to never show weakness. But Jack made her feel as if she were losing her grip on that control, and she hated it. His presence, his confidence, the way he spoke to her, it all unraveled the tight hold she had on herself. It was early one morning when Ilara found herself standing in front of the window in her quarters, gazing out at the bustling base. She had always admired the efficiency and orderliness of human operations. The soldiers, the machines, the precise movements, all of it fascinated her. Yet there was something about it that felt foreign, even alien, to her. It was as if everything had its place, and there was no room for anything to deviate from the norm. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye, and for a brief moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The princess, the leader of her people, appeared so distant, as if she were a different person entirely. She quickly pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand, the peace talks. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and before she could answer, the door swung open to reveal Jack. His presence was always immediate, filling the room with an air of authority. Yet at the same time, he never made her feel small. It was a strange contradiction that Ilara couldn't quite understand. "Good morning, Princess," Jack said with a slight smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Ilara turned to face him, her posture stiff as she straightened her robes. "Not at all," she replied coolly. "What brings you here?" Jack stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space as though he were considering something. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his tone more serious than usual, "about the peace talks. I know things are getting tense, and I thought you might need a break." Ilara raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "A break? From what exactly?" she asked, though she couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. The weight of the peace talks had been heavy on her shoulders, and the constant pressure from her own people only made it worse. "You've been working nonstop," Jack said, his gaze softening. "It's okay to take a moment for yourself. Even the strongest leaders need to step back sometimes." Ilara felt a strange sensation in her chest, one that she quickly brushed off. She wasn't used to being spoken to in such a manner, so casually, as if they were equals. She had to remind herself that Jack was a human soldier, not someone from her world. She was above him, no matter how different he seemed from the others. "I do not need rest," she said firmly, her voice regaining its usual calm composure. "I am here for a purpose, Jack. Rest will have to wait." Jack sighed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're as stubborn as they say," he said, shaking his head. "But I respect that." Ilara felt a twinge of irritation. "Respect is hardly necessary. I am here to lead, not to entertain." "You don't entertain," Jack replied, stepping closer. "You inspire. You've already made a big impression on everyone here." Ilara wasn't sure why his words affected her. Perhaps it was the sincerity in his voice, or maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with fear or awe, but with admiration and respect. She had spent so much time trying to maintain the image of a distant, untouchable leader, but Jack's attitude made her feel like something more, a person, not just a title. Before she could respond, a loud beeping sound interrupted them both. Ilara's communicator flashed, signaling an urgent message. Her posture instantly straightened, her focus shifting entirely. "Excuse me," she said quickly, turning toward the device. "This may be important." Jack stepped back, giving her space as she activated the communicator. The face of her advisor appeared on the screen, his expression grave. "Princess Ilara, we have a situation," he said, his voice tense. "There are reports of a skirmish along the border. Some of your people are demanding action." Ilara's mind instantly shifted to strategy. Her people's safety was her priority, and she knew she had to act quickly. But her gaze flicked to Jack, who was still standing quietly by the door. A strange sense of unease settled over her. He wasn't part of her world, but at that moment, she knew she might need his help. The human soldiers were skilled in combat, and their experience could make a difference. "I'll be there immediately," Ilara said to her advisor, cutting the communication short. She turned back to Jack, her expression hardening. "There's no time to waste. I need to go." Jack nodded, his demeanor shifting as he fell into his usual role of protector. "I'll go with you. We can't let you face this alone." Ilara hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had always preferred to handle matters herself, but the situation was more complex than she had anticipated. Perhaps it was time to accept help, even if it came from a human soldier. "Very well," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go." Together, they made their way through the corridors of the base, the tension between them palpable. Ilara's thoughts raced, her mind already calculating the best course of action. The situation at the border was escalating, and her people's lives were at risk. But as they walked side by side, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between her and Jack. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she couldn't ignore it forever. Ilara stood at the edge of the command center, her gaze fixed on the large holographic map in front of her. The situation was critical. Her people, the alien forces, had encountered human resistance at the border, and it was unclear whether the skirmish would escalate into full-blown conflict. Tensions had been simmering for days, and now it was up to Ilara to maintain control and prevent a war from breaking out. The map showed red dots, signifying areas where fighting had already begun. It made her stomach churn to see so much red. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain peace and order, but this situation was far beyond her control. Beside her, Jack stood quietly, his eyes scanning the holographic display. His calm presence had been a source of comfort during the chaos, but Ilara couldn't help but feel uneasy. She didn't know why, but something about the situation made her nervous. Perhaps it was the thought of having to make difficult decisions, or perhaps it was the constant reminder that everything she knew was being tested. "Princess," Jack's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need to act quickly. If we don't, the situation might spiral out of control." Ilara turned to face him, her expression hardening. She had been trained to be a leader, to make decisions under pressure, but she was finding it difficult to focus. She couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't yet figured out. "You're right," she said, her voice tight. "We need to stop this before it gets worse." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "I've been talking to my team. We have the means to contain this conflict, but we'll need your cooperation." Ilara hesitated. The idea of relying on human soldiers, even with their experience, was not something she was comfortable with. She had always believed that her people could handle matters themselves. But this was different. The human forces were formidable, and they had the tactical advantage on the ground. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her tone more neutral now. "We need to make a show of force," Jack said, his eyes flickering to the hologram. "Not an all-out attack, but a controlled response. We show them that we're serious about peace, but we're not afraid to defend ourselves." Ilara thought for a moment, considering his words. A show of force. It wasn't a solution she would have normally considered, but desperate times called for desperate measures. If this was what it took to preserve peace, then so be it. "Very well," she said, turning back to the map. "We'll deploy our forces in key locations to assert control, but I will not start a war." Jack's expression softened slightly. "I understand. We just need to make sure they know we're not backing down." Ilara took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the map once again. There was no turning back now. The battle was already underway, and it was up to her to ensure that it didn't destroy everything she had worked for. As she gave the orders to her commanders, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She had always relied on her intellect and her ability to strategize. But this time, there was something more, something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the political situation that troubled her. It was Jack. The human soldier had a way of making her question everything she thought she knew about herself. His confidence, his calm demeanor, his unwavering belief in her, it all made her feel something unfamiliar. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted. Not now, not when everything was on the line. But as she turned to walk toward the door, she felt Jack's presence beside her. His steady gaze met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. She didn't know what it was about him, but the tension between them was palpable. She had always maintained control over her emotions, but Jack made that control feel fragile, like a thread ready to snap. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "We don't have to go down this path. We can find another way." Ilara looked at him, searching his face for any hint of uncertainty. But there was none. Jack believed in her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, that belief made her feel vulnerable. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice firm. "This is the only way to ensure the survival of both our people." Jack nodded, though there was something in his eyes that Elara couldn't quite place, a glimmer of something deeper. She couldn't tell if it was concern or something else, but she didn't have time to think about it. There were more important matters at hand. As they made their way to the battlefield, Elara's mind raced. She had never been in a situation quite like this before. Her people had always been peaceful, and though she had trained for war, it had never been something she hoped to face. But now, there was no escaping it. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors, and Elara felt a strange sense of determination building within her. She had to do what was best for her people. She couldn't afford to hesitate or second-guess herself. This was the moment that would define her leadership, and she would not falter. Jack walked beside her, his presence a quiet strength. She couldn't help but wonder if he would be there for her after this, whether the connection between them would survive the storm that was about to unfold. They arrived at the command center, where the soldiers were already preparing for the next phase of the operation. Elara gave her final orders, her voice steady as she guided her forces into action. The battle had only just begun, and there was no turning back now. The battlefield was alive with movement. Soldiers from both sides were gearing up for the next phase of the operation. The tension was thick in the air, and it felt as though the slightest spark could ignite the entire conflict. Elara stood at the command center, watching the preparations unfold with a sense of unease that refused to leave her. She had given her orders, but now the real test was about to begin. Would her plan work? Would her people hold their ground and avoid escalating the situation into an all-out war? Beside her, Jack stood in silence, his expression unreadable. It was hard to read him, especially now, when everything felt so uncertain. He was the human soldier, the one who had seen so many battles, and yet he was calm in the face of this. Elara envied that calmness, even as it made her feel vulnerable. "Are we ready?" Elara asked, breaking the silence. Jack nodded. "We're ready. But the real challenge will come once we engage. We have to make sure we don't push them too far." Elara turned to face him, her gaze steady. "We'll do what we can to stop it before it gets worse." The words sounded reassuring, but deep down, Elara wasn't sure if she believed them. Could she really stop this before it spiraled out of control? The pressure weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had been trained to lead, to protect her people, but this felt different. It wasn't just a war to her people, it was a test of everything she believed in. As they prepared to move, Elara found herself standing at the edge of the command center, looking out at the soldiers who were preparing to march into battle. She could see the determination in their eyes, the unwavering belief that they were fighting for a just cause. But what if this wasn't the right path? What if there was another way to resolve the conflict? "Are you sure this is the only option?" Jack asked, his voice soft but insistent. Elara didn't hesitate. "We've already crossed the line. There's no turning back now." She knew the human soldier was right. There had to be another way. But the situation was too dire to consider anything else. Her people were already in danger, and if she didn't act, there would be no peace left to salvage. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts, and she turned to see one of her commanders approach, his face tense. "Princess, the situation has escalated," he said urgently. "The human forces are moving in faster than we expected." Elara's heart raced. This was it. The battle was no longer a matter of strategy. It was a matter of survival. "We need to hold them off," Elara said quickly. "Deploy the reinforcements. Get everyone into position." Her voice was calm, but inside, her emotions were a swirl of uncertainty. She knew what needed to be done, but the cost of failure was unimaginable. There were too many lives at stake. As the troops moved into place, Elara's mind wandered back to the conversation she had with Jack earlier. Could they really avoid war? Was there a way out of this nightmare? She looked over at him, her eyes searching his face. She wanted to believe that everything could still be resolved peacefully, but there was a part of her that feared the worst. "Stay close," she said quietly, her voice betraying her unease. Jack met her gaze with a reassuring look. I'm not going anywhere. Ilara didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since this conflict began, she felt a small sense of peace in knowing that Jack would be by her side. He had always been steady, unwavering in his loyalty, and that gave her the strength to face what was coming. The battle began just as the first wave of reinforcements arrived. The sound of weapons clashing, the shouts of soldiers, and the steady march of the alien forces filled the air. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the chaos unfold. The human forces weren't giving up easily. They were skilled, determined, and they fought with a ferocity that Ilara had never seen before. She had always known that humans were resilient, but witnessing it firsthand was both humbling and terrifying. Despite the intensity of the battle, Ilara refused to back down. She had given everything to her people, and she would not let them lose hope now. She stood tall, commanding her forces with precision and unwavering resolve. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the situation was not going as planned. The human forces were pushing harder, and her own troops were starting to falter. It was a hard truth to face, but Ilara knew that they couldn't keep fighting this way. She had to find a way to stop the conflict before it consumed them all. She looked to Jack, who had been moving alongside the troops, coordinating their efforts with the same calm determination that had become his trademark. He was a natural leader, and Ilara had come to rely on his judgment in ways she hadn't expected. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "This isn't working." Jack nodded, his expression grim. "I know. We need to pull back, regroup, and think of another strategy. We can't keep pushing like this." Ilara knew he was right. The battle had gone on long enough. There had to be another way, a way to stop this without sacrificing more lives. "I'll talk to the commander," Ilara said. "We need to stop this now, before it's too late." Jack's eyes softened, and for a moment, Ilara felt a spark of something more. It was as if, in the midst of all the chaos, they had found a way to communicate without words. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that, whatever happened, they would face it together. The battlefield was quieter now, the sound of combat having died down. The dust of conflict still hung in the air, but for a moment, everything seemed to pause as if waiting for something. Ilara stood in the center of the war-torn landscape, the weight of her decisions heavy on her shoulders. She had hoped for peace, but she had never imagined it would be this hard to achieve. Beside her, Jack scanned the horizon, his expression unreadable. The two of them had seen the cost of this battle up close, and it was clear to both of them that the conflict could not continue. Too much had been lost already. "It's over, isn't it?" Ilara asked softly, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and relief. Jack turned to look at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's not over yet, but it can be. We have to act now, before it gets worse." Ilara nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that there was still much work to be done. The battle had ended, but the real challenge was just beginning. How would she rebuild what had been broken? How could she find a way to restore peace after everything that had happened? "We have to show them that we're willing to compromise," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "We can't just keep fighting." Jack agreed, stepping closer. "The humans will follow your lead, Ilara. You've shown them your strength, but now you have to show them your heart. They'll respect that." It was the kind of advice that made Ilara pause. She had spent so much time focused on her duty, on being strong for her people, that she had almost forgotten what it meant to lead with compassion. Maybe that was the key to ending the conflict once and for all. She turned her gaze toward the campfires of her soldiers, who were beginning to settle after the intense battle. There were still injuries to tend to, but the majority of her forces had come through the fight relatively unscathed. They were tired, but they were alive. The same could not be said for many of the humans on the opposing side, though. "Can we really make them listen?" Ilara asked, her voice uncertain. "Can we convince them that peace is possible after all this?" Jack smiled, his usual calm demeanor returning. You've already shown them that you're capable of more than just fighting. They'll listen, Ilara. They'll follow you." Ilara looked into his eyes, and for the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that with Jack's support and the determination of her people, she could find a way forward. They all could. With a deep breath, Ilara turned to face her commander, who was approaching with a serious look on his face. His clothes were torn, and his expression was grim, but there was a new determination in his eyes. "The enemy is retreating," he said. "We've won this battle, Princess, but we still need to make sure they don't come back." Ilara nodded, her voice steady as she gave the order to begin the peace talks. "Prepare a message. We will offer them a ceasefire. I'll speak with their leader personally." The commander hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure if this was the right course of action. But Ilara's resolve was firm. She had made her decision, and now she had to see it through. As the message was sent to the opposing forces, Ilara and Jack stood together in silence, watching as the sun began to set. The sky was a deep orange, the colors stretching across the horizon like a canvas waiting to be painted. "We'll do it," Jack said quietly. "We'll make it work. You'll see." Ilara didn't answer right away, her mind racing with the possibilities. Could they really bring about peace? Could they truly build a future where both sides could coexist? It seemed impossible, yet she knew that it was worth trying. The lives of her people, and of all those who had fought and suffered, depended on it. The messenger returned moments later, and Ilara took a deep breath as she read the message. The enemy commander had agreed to meet with her. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The real battle would come in the negotiations, but for now, Ilara allowed herself a brief moment of relief. "Jack, we did it," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack gave her a small, reassuring smile. "This is just the beginning, Ilara. Now we show them what humanity, and your people, can do together." Ilara nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead of her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready. With Jack by her side and her people rallying behind her, she knew that there was hope for the future. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Ilara had learned something important during the course of this conflict. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in fighting, but in the willingness to build something better. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she was ready to face it head-on, with an open heart and an unwavering belief in the possibility of peace. And so, with the sun setting behind her, Ilara stepped forward into the unknown, determined to create a new path for her people and the humans who had once been their enemies.